this project Maxim very good China, India, and the US. So that's why we go
Okay, it's great. Thank you all for coming tonight to our CSOC panel, which is the last week of term, as we all know, week 8. And it's wonderful to see all of you be here, including our students at the back. Usually students sit at the back. I don't know why. But we have a very, very interesting panel tonight, talking about Russia and the invasion in Ukraine, the war, and the impact on Southeast Europe. Southeast Europe, an area comprising Balkans, Western and Eastern Balkans, Greece, and Turkey in our world at CSOCs. And we've got a great expertise tonight with us, who will be covering some of the themes on the impact of the war on our region, on our CSOCs region, as we call it. And starting with, in the speaking order, I will introduce them with Julie Newton, who is also a member of our CSOC steering committee, and with whom, and together with Dina Dabechev as well, devised that plot for tonight. And Julie, as many of you may know, she's a research fellow at the Russian and Eurasian Center. She's also an associate professor at the Department of International Comparative Politics at the American University in Paris. So she's between Paris and Oxford. But she's also very relevant to us. She's the principal investigator of the university consortium, which discusses but also networks on Russian and European relations, and it's a consortium of 6 or 7 universities. Then after Julie, we will ask Maxim, who sadly cannot make it to our panel today, but it's wonderful to have you, Maxim, with us. And Maxim Samorukov is a fellow at Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center. His research focuses very much on Russia's relations with the state of Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe. And he will be focusing, obviously, on, from a comparative perspective, on Russia and the Balkans. Julie, by the way, will be talking about Russia and European relations more broadly. Then after Maxim, there's Kyril Drezov here, who's at the Department of Politics at Keele University. And Keele has been in our panels before. He also himself is a founding member of the Southeast European Unit at Keele University, and has written extensively on the Balkans from a historical perspective as well. And he will be talking about Russia, the Russian factor in the region, and mostly focusing also on Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece. And last but not least, Vuksanovic, who came from Belgrade for us, and he has a PhD from the LSE. His work has been on geopolitics, on Russia's influence in the Balkans in general. He's very interested, obviously, on Serbian politics as well. And he will be focusing on Serbia, which is a very interesting case, as we all know, in the light of Russia's influence in the Balkans. So let's start with Julie, asking for 12 minutes each, and then we will have a discussion, and you can put your questions to the speakers.
Thank you, Othon. Thank you all and thank you, Dimitra, for starting all this. And I'm just sad that Maxim, that you can't be here. And I hasten to add that it's not his fault. It's he was not, that somehow that visa did not come through, and that's the fault, I think, of all of these European visa offices that are not coming through with this. But anyway, I just wanted to say I'm glad you're here anyway. I want to zoom out. We thought that it might be a good idea to start by zooming out to examine how Southeast Europe, our CSOCs region, as Othon called it, fits into Russia's broader confrontation with the West. And in this confrontation, Russian analysts today, your general Russian analysts will generally cite two nested goals. The first goal is that Russia's near and midterm goal, and that is to, and I quote Russian analysts here, this is not my view, and all of this is from a Russian perspective today from me. It's to neutralize threats to Russia that come from Ukraine and Europe, and to reformulate European security on more favorable terms to Moscow, while simultaneously deterring the United States, the EU, or NATO, and European member states from escalating military engagement directly with Russia. Russia's second goal extends beyond Ukraine and the conflict there. And it's the one that I would like to focus on with my remarks today. It's about shifting the international balance of power away from the United States and away from the West in order to reshape the international order. Russia sees itself in an almost permanent struggle with the United States and with the EU to replace the current Western-led order, and with one that is more fully multipolar, one that promises greater equality for the non-West and obviously for Russia, and that is centered on a reformed United Nations. As Sergei Karaganov, who used to be a colleague of mine and who is constantly in the fray of commenting on this conflict, as he says, Russia envisions a Russia-China-led partnership with the global majority, as it's called in Russia, to end 500 years of European or Western dominance. Russia views itself as the vanguard of this international systemic transformation, and Ukraine and the conflict with Ukraine sits at the epicenter of this broader struggle for global fairness, equality, and balance in Russia's view. Now, these twin Russian goals mean that war with the United States and its allies is now a permanent feature of the Putin regime. It means that the Kremlin, in the words of Sir Laurie Bristow, the former UK ambassador to Russia, it means that war, the Kremlin has now reversed Clausewitz's dictum. If Clausewitz saw war as the continuation of politics by other means, the Kremlin now sees politics as the continuation of war by other means. It's the continuation of politics as continuation of war by other means. This is where the CSOX region comes in. This is where Southeast Europe region comes in. The CSOX region is a significant battlefield and battleground in this confrontation. For Russia, on the one side, the region holds value in advancing its political warfare objectives rather than serving as a second military front, because Russia has no need for another kinetic conflict. Instead, Moscow leverages entrenched ethnic grievances and divisions, particularly in the West Balkans, to stir up trouble through hybrid and spoiler tactics. For Europe, on the other side, Southeast Europe is important as a center of gray zone insecurity. Because as German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock emphatically stated, we need to make it clear that there can be no more gray zones in Europe, because that is where external intervention is possible. She thus called for fast-tracking integration of these gray zone countries into Europe and NATO. President Macron also passionately speaks out for speeding up the integration calendars for the West Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia in response to Russia's profound challenge to the geopolitical balance of power in Europe. But Russia actually prefers gray zones, since it's in the gray zones that Russia can most easily weaken the EU and Western cohesion, and therefore shift the balance of international forces to Moscow's favor. Keeping West Balkans stuck in the gray, that is, keeping them in the EU and NATO waiting rooms, fuels local frustration and makes these countries more susceptible to illiberal populist and Russian influence campaigns. It fuels an arc of instability, as Dimitar calls it, that cuts through Eastern and Southeast Europe. Now, what are the tools that Russia relies on in this political war with the West? Well, we've got a whole panel to discuss them, but very quickly, I'll just list some of them that very briefly, so we can discuss them in detail. One of the most valuable, of course, and currently relevant is the illiberal populist leaders like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who is the leading cheerleader of Serbia's President Vučić and Republika Srpska's Milorad Dodik. These illiberal populist leaders like Dodik could thwart NATO accession for candidate members like Bosnia and Herzegovina, or Orban could veto Ukraine or Moldova's chances for entering NATO. They're certainly one of the big reasons, Hungary is one of the big reasons why so many people think that NATO accession would never even get past the first vote. So Orban, however, does support EU expansion for the West Balkans, and he does so for a variety of reasons. But one reason is very interesting to me, and it is to build a bloc of like-minded countries with Hungary in order to challenge EU centralization and to demand greater national sovereignty for these countries. Such a bloc of like-minded illiberal states could become a powerful in-house European platform for authoritarian practices and be valuable be valuable to Russia and China as influenced by these authoritarian great powers. Another Russian tactical tool is to deepen state capture in these countries by private illiberal economic interest across southeastern Europe, especially in Vučić's Serbia and Dodik's Republika Srpska. And Russia uses state capture, systemic corruption, ethnic grievances to strengthen illiberal nationalist and Russia-friendly forces across the region. And in all this, of course, you have RT Balkans and Sputnik Serbia to serve as local amplifiers of these disruptor messages. But of course, there's nuance here. Russia hardly controls southeastern Europe, and Western Balkans are not fully aligned with Moscow anyway. Instead, as I'm sure we're going to discuss, countries like Serbia pursue multi-vectored foreign policies, not alliance with Russia. That benefits Moscow, interestingly enough, because Serbia's multi-vectored approach slows NATO and EU accessions and weakens Western unity and divides the West, but at little cost to Moscow. Moscow's keen to avoid expensive alliances. Additionally, Serbia's economic ties with China help offset and counterbalance Serbia's dependence upon the EU, which indirectly supports Russia's interests. As Serb President Vučić puts it, I sit on a Serbian chair only, and I'm proud of that. By balancing relations with the EU, the United States, Russia, and China, actually sitting on 4 chairs, Serbia avoids taking sides. And for small gray zone countries like Serbia, this balancing act ensures autonomy, while for Russia, it is sufficient to slow Western integration efforts. Vučić's Serbia first and Dodik's disruptive policies inside Bosnia and Herzegovina also benefit Moscow by playing the EU and the United States off each other in the region, further dividing the transatlantic alliance and diminishing the EU's geoeconomic and geopolitical stature. Ultimately, Russia can rely on countries like Serbia as low-cost spoilers within the Western sphere rather than expensive allies that would be difficult, if not impossible, to win over completely. Finally, into this context enters Trump 2.0. How will Trump 2.0 affect Russia's calculations of strategic balance of forces with the West? And how does Southeast European region fit into these Russian calculations? Does Moscow see Trump as a positive factor? Well, yes and no, or as just about any Russian will answer any question done yet. Let's start with the positive side. Russia has sought to divide the US from Europe since the mid-1990s, and actually it was the main Soviet Westpolitik since the time of Charles de Gaulle. But more recently, since in 2023, with the Russia's current foreign policy concept, this concept encourages divisions between the US, UK, and Atlanticist bloc in the Western Alliance, and the EU bloc of states that includes France and others that seek greater strategic autonomy for Europe. It's always encouraged, even by 2023, it encouraged those kinds of divisions, saying that maybe it's possible to have a more beneficial Europe if it becomes more autonomous and independent. But Trump's return is making Moscow rethink this old reflex of promoting European autonomy and Atlantic divisions here, at least in terms of by promoting European independence. Because the prospect of Trump's return is accelerating ominous shifts in Europe, prompting Moscow to rethink the idea of strategic autonomy in far more negative terms. Many Moscow experts viewed the Biden administration as a restraining force on Europe's more hawkish members. And if Trump were to significantly pull the US back from Europe, then Europe would be compelled to defend Ukraine and itself independently. European states are already preparing for this scenario, forming new coalitions of the willing, or at least discussing the formation of coalitions of the willing that would likely include France, Germany, and many others without coordinated, restraining leadership of the United States. NATO is proposing a switch from what was called a US-led, EU-assisted NATO to a more EU-led, US-assisted NATO. European countries are thus discussing independent actions such as sending their troops into Ukraine and deploying more long-range missiles of their own inside Russia. Others, like Poland, are even proposing seeking their own nuclear weapons. What this suggests is that Europe on its own could be more hawkish, unrestrained, unpredictable, and uncoordinated, posing profound strategic dangers to Russian security and deeply alarming Moscow. And this is some of the latest big discussions in Valdai, in the Valdai discussion group in Riyadh, and also in Russian Global Affairs, various Russian and Russian Academy of Sciences. So it's in various research places, not just in one, this fear of these ominous trends inside Europe. And then the trends that we're going to discuss today in Southeast and Eastern Europe are seen by some in Moscow as potentially helpful for Russia. Given what Dimitar again describes as the arrival of Super Orban, I love that phrase, across the pond, we now have what I like to call the increased likelihood of the Urbanization of Southeast Europe, especially in the West Balkans and possibly now also in Romania, if the ultra-nationalist pro-Russian Georgescu wins Romanian elections on December the 8th. Trump 2.0 already promises to be hyper-transactionalist and cronyist in the region, just as Trump 1.0 was, which weakens the rule of law and liberal democracy and boosts populist nationalist leaders with pro-Russian or neutral Russian sympathies. So integrating these illiberal, Russia-friendly member states inside the EU could actually dilute the EU's capacity to confront Russia, and it could help counterbalance any coalitions of hawkish member states. Just last phrase. Much depends, of course, on this what Trump 2.0 actually does. There is no guarantee that he will, in fact, pull out of NATO, abandon Ukraine, or be less hawkish than Europe towards Russia. What is certain is this unpredictable context is that Russia is increasingly alarmed by what it sees as Western escalatory actions in Ukraine and Russia, while the West is increasingly alarmed by what it sees as Russia's escalatory hybrid war against Europe. And in this context, Southeast Europe remains a dynamic political battleground in the Russia-West struggle, and it is a poor region to watch.
Thank you very much, Julie, for this wider framework, and at the same time also updating the discussion with Trump and even the Romanian elections that are a very, very recent development. Now, Maxim, can we continue with you? Please proceed with your own kind of presentation. And 12 minutes, please, okay?
Okay, sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry for not being with you physically. Yeah, I'll try to concentrate more on how
Can you hear? Sorry, can you hear people? Can we kind of turn the volume on?
I don't know. I'm using a mic. I don't know. Do you hear me? I hear you perfectly. I don't know whether you hear me or not. The sound is on.
If you can just speak up or put the microphone closer to your mouth, it would be
Okay,
better.
I think I'm already as close as possible, but okay. Okay, maybe I should not use it. Let's try this. Do you hear me better? This way?
It's the same.
The same. Okay.
Yeah.
Then I'll return to this because I hear this one. Sorry for this technical nuances. Yeah. Okay, I'll try to speak. Yeah, I'll try to speak louder. I hope this level of loudness is okay. I'll try to concentrate on how this war has transformed Russia's relations with its allies in Southeastern Europe. Yeah, because Southeastern Europe is the last region in Europe where Russia can claim that it has allies. Yeah, despite 2 years of or more than almost 3 years of the ongoing war. And this is very surprising because when the war started, it seemed that it's a reason enough to eliminate Russia's influence in the Southeastern Europe completely. Yeah, for the very reason which has just been mentioned by Julie, that having a gray zone on the border of the European Union is too much a luxury at the moment when Russia is waging a full-scale war and is ignoring even the most basic rules of international order. Yeah, you just can't afford to have such a luxury. And at the day the war started on the February 24th, I was speaking at the Balkan Forum in Budapest together with Vuk, and my take was that, okay, the war means that we can stop talking about Russia in Southeastern Europe. Yeah, because it's too much a danger, and it won't be tolerated by the West. But it turned out differently. Now, I was not the only one who expected the Russian influence to disappear. Actually, even Gazprom in the spring of 22 was preparing to sell its Serbian subsidiary. Yeah, there were serious preparations, but no, eventually things turned differently. And now we see that Russia remains in the Southeastern Europe. And it's not only remains. In some countries, the war indeed was very, very damaging for the Russian presence. If we look, for example, at Bulgaria, we see that before the war, Russia was the main energy partner of Bulgaria in all spheres. It was the main provider of gas, the main provider of oil, the main provider of nuclear fuel, but it took less than 3 years of the war for Bulgaria to sever all these energy dependencies on Russia. But in other cases, with those countries who call themselves Russian allies, things are very different. In fact, they now get much more Russian attention than they used to before the war. And the reason is very simple. It's the last countries in Europe who are ready to cooperate with Russia amid the war in Ukraine. Now we see that, for example, if RT wants to open a new language edition in Europe, it has to do it in the Balkans, simply because in other countries it's no longer possible. And we saw that in the late 22 when RT Balkans was established. Now, when, for example, the St. Petersburg Economic Forum wants to invite someone from Europe, the only option they have is to invite Milorad Dodik, simply because no other European politician of significance is ready to go to St. Petersburg amid the war. In the same in the similar vein, we see that a speaker of the parliament of Republika Srpska now is receiving standing ovations in the Russian parliament simply because he is one of the last European politicians who is ready to attend Russian parliament and to communicate with Russian MPs. Yeah. So the attention Russia pays to the Western Balkans has increased manifold. And it's not only that, it's also that those few entities which still remain Russia, which still claim to be Russian allies, thanks to the war, have been able to transform their relations with Russia, to rebalance their relations with Russia very much in their favor. And I think Serbia is the best example here. Before the just we can compare Russia-Serbian relations before the war and after that. Before the war, Serbia was just a minor client of Gazprom, whom Gazprom could have turned off with no pain, without any big costs, because it was just a very small market in comparison to other European markets. Now Serbia is one of the, I think starting from January 25, it will be one of the only 2 countries in Europe who are still buying Russian gas. And if Russia wants its Turkish stream to continue to function, Russia has to accommodate Serbia on its gas needs. And we already know that the new, very profitable for Serbia gas contract and multi-year gas contract between Russia and Serbia is already in the works and will be signed in the coming weeks, maybe in a month or 2 at best. In another domain, if we look at security domain, before the war, Serbia was conducting joint military drills with the West and with Russia, more rarely, but still. Since the war started, Serbia restored its joint drills with the West, but didn't restore any joint drills with Russia and got no criticism coming from Moscow. Even more striking is that Serbia was able to provide Ukraine with weapons for hundreds of thousands of euros, and still the Serbian leadership has not received any critical words coming from Moscow because of that. Even in this very sensitive, issue for Russia, Russia didn't criticize Serbia for helping Ukraine to kill basically Russian soldiers. And even on the personal level, if we look at that, Vučić was able to skip all the personal meetings with Putin simply because the optics of such meetings has become very much inconvenient for him, and send instead of him Alexander Vulin, and Putin accepted that. And now we have Vulin having one-on-one meetings with Putin, even though Putin is Putin, while Vulin is just a vice prime minister of Serbia with no significant powers. This was also accepted by Moscow without criticism, without any grumbling. And basically, if we try to sum up that Serbia, thanks to the war, which has undermined Russia's leverage in the region so much, Serbia has been able to get from Russia everything it needs, like support on Kosovo, cheap gas, domestic legitimacy. All that is still provided by Russia to the Serbian leadership and to Alexander Vučić. But Serbia doesn't pay much for that. Actually, Serbia stopped paying for that even with symbolic steps like personal meetings between Vučić and Putin. So summing up, we see that despite very gloomy prospects for Russian presence in the Western Balkans, now there is no end in sight. After 3 years of the war, Russia is still there. But the only difference, but very significant difference, is that local actors have been able to transform this relationship in their very much in their favor. And now they are even more in charge of shaping these relations than they have ever been. And Russia is kind of much more subsidiary force in this relationship, who has to accommodate its local allies to sustain its pressure in the region. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maxim. And that's a very interesting point on how local actors are actually empowered when sometimes in reality we believe that it's a great power that has the upper hand. Now we continue with Kyril.
I will look at the regional dimension. Now, the previous speakers have talked about the global trends, about how Russia has accommodated itself vis-a-vis the region, and I will look at how the region has reacted to the changes, to the shifts after 2022. Now, the biggest thing that happened is that Russia almost overnight turned into a pariah state, facing levels of mistrust, ostracism, and isolation comparable to the 1917-1933 period. So this is something that hasn't happened for a very, very long time. That Russia would be so much mistrusted and isolated, and a pariah state obviously has to beg for attention and has to accommodate its potential partners in the Balkans far more, as Maxim has outlined. Now, what were the effects on the countries in Southeastern Europe? The first thing that I want to emphasize is the security situation has changed for the worse for these countries, because if we look a bit earlier from over the period of the last 25 years, these countries, the main interest of these countries is to have Ukraine in its pre-2014 borders as a buffer separating it from Russia. No country in Southeastern Europe wants a border with Russia, not even Hungary. So this thing, paradoxically, what has happened from 2014 onwards is that the moves to integrate Ukraine with the West, step by step, have actually eroded this buffer state and has brought Russia closer and closer to the Balkans, closer and closer to Southeastern Europe. And one thing that is often forgotten in commentaries about this region is that actually this is the most exposed part of the European Union and of NATO. The most exposed part of the European Union and NATO to the war in Ukraine, to the Russian-Ukrainian front. You can see for yourselves how physically close Romania is to the front line, all the Black Sea countries. People usually talk about the potential threat to the Baltic states, about Poland, but what is often forgotten is that countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, to a lesser extent Greece, they are right next to the front line and coming closer and closer to the front line. And in particular, I will talk about this in several minutes, is Romania is very dangerously enmeshed with Moldova. Moldova is enmeshed with Transnistria, Gagauzia, and this is a potential powder keg. And it is precisely there, on right of the border of Romania. Romania is in a far more dangerous situation in this respect than, say, Poland. So these countries, as a result of the invasion of 2022, have faced unprecedented security pressures. Now, what about the energy situation? What you see here is how Russia imagined its energy network in the early 21st century, and with one very important change, the emergence of Turk Stream instead of South Stream. This is how it obtained prior to 2022. Now, this is what made Russia as an energy superpower, especially in the countries of Eastern Europe. With the exception of Turk Stream, all the other important elements like Nord Stream, we know what happened with that. But Turk Stream has actually mitigated the energy pressures. What exactly is being transported by Turk Stream is anybody's guess. When people say that Azeri gas is flowing into Europe via Turk Stream, well, maybe it's Russian, but the survival of Turk Stream has become a major preoccupation for Russia and a major leverage for countries like Turkey, first and foremost, but also Serbia, Bulgaria, Hungary. So the energy disruptions did not develop to such an extent as it did in 2022. Countries have adapted, and Turk Stream has mitigated the picture for Russia. Now, concerning the individual, well, there is the issue of migration from both Ukraine and Russia. I suppose Vuk would mention what Belgrade has become as a major hub of immigrants from Russia, also from Ukraine. In the Bulgarian case, it is far more from Ukraine than from Russia. But migration has become a very important factor in the internal development of these countries. And there was an inevitable backlash because of rising rents and all kinds of things. But we can talk about this in the discussion. Concerning the local responses, I have divided the countries into two groups. Three more of the same, three countries more of the same, and two that I see have undergone profound change after 2022. The more of the same is, and I'll be very brief, the more of the same is Turkey. So Turkey hasn't behaved very differently after 2022. It has behaved precisely as it was behaving before 2022, only more so. So Turkish interests, right and center, manipulating friends, allies, partners, anybody, just for immediate gain. And President Erdogan has reaped enormous benefits from that. Of course, Turkey also has weaknesses, and President Erdogan would owe favors, and some of his allies would owe him favors, like in Syria or perhaps in Azerbaijan. But I hope we'll have time to discuss Turkey in greater detail because it has become a very pivotal country after 2022. Another more of the same is Serbia. So again, Serbia is not behaving radically different than before 2022, but I would say again more so. And Serbian leverage has increased, as Maxim emphasized. And with this pictorial impression of what was the situation before 2022, I'll leave it to Vuk to fill you in with details on that. Now, in the case of Bulgaria, again, more of the same. The traditional Russophile divide has deepened, exacerbated accusations for left, right, and center. And the cartoon up there that shows a red star being turned into a NATO star has a modern inclination these days when a local oligarch who has been sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act has seen the light and has suddenly become the greatest Atlanticist of all. And only last week he was awarded, he given a special award from Ukraine for his contribution to Ukraine's defense. So you can see these things that you can see pictorially there have been exacerbated, but Now, a country that has undergone profound change in 2022, and this is the most exposed country. I said Romania is most dangerously enmeshed with Moldova and Moldova, Transnistria, etc., etc. And it also looked like a very staunch pro-Atlantic, pro-NATO country until very recently. Until in the last week's presidential elections, 30% was obtained by ultra-nationalist Eurosceptic parties. I would strongly object to calling them pro-Russian. I hope there are people that will take the Romanian angle, but to talk about, and this has been in the media a lot, pro-Russian, 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 calling Georgescu being pro-Russian, the 30% going to pro-Russian forces. I think this is not the case. The reasons are primarily internal for these people emerging. There is, of course, a great alarm in Romania that Romania may be sleepwalking into the conflict, or the conflict may be sleepwalking into towards Romania because of the situation in Moldova. So a very, very dangerous situation. Romania has been, I would say, one of the most affected countries after 2022. It's not more of the same. Romania is very, very different now compared to what it was before 2022. And finally, Greece. I would say again, and I'm saying this with some trepidation because there are lots of people with far greater knowledge of Greece than me. But in my impression, again, Greece historically, for the first time, has abandoned the Russian angle in its foreign policy, and it has unequivocally sided, gone sort of center stage onto the Western mainstream. And last week's visit of Mark Rutte in Greece, not surprisingly, and the agreement that Greece would train F-16 pilots, and all that. Greece has gained. Greek ports have played a crucial role in supplying Ukraine around the Bosphorus, through Bulgaria, Romania, etc., up north. So Greece again, I would say, has been profoundly changed. It has become far more pro-Western, pro-mainstream Western, and with it seemingly without much of opposition. Now, how sustainable is that? Is anybody's guess. We can talk about it. And finally, I would mention three things that just to hopefully generate discussion that are little commented about. Now, the first thing is Romania and Moldova. How would Romania react if Moldova explodes and it's somehow involved with Transnistria, Russian involvement, and if Russian troops move towards Odessa? It's a very, very question, and I have no answer to that. Hopefully, you may provide some suggestions for that. Again, I want to emphasize that Romania is the most dangerously exposed country for a lot of reasons, and it doesn't get the coverage that it deserves for this extremely dangerous situation it is in. Obviously, we have seen the internal reaction to that danger. The second thing I want to mention is in Bulgaria, the migration issue. The Ukrainians that have moved to Bulgaria have had one very paradoxical effect. The Ukrainians that have moved to Bulgaria are overwhelming. They're over 95% Russian speakers. So paradoxically, the Russian language have gone down to the smallest village in Bulgaria. Never seen Russian spoken so much as a result of the Ukrainian migration. So I leave it to you to think about it. And the last thing about Greece, that's probably the biggest stone that I'll throw, is the effect on Greece and long-term Greek politics of the ecumenical patriarchs quarrel with the patriarch, the all-Russian patriarch in Moscow. Now, I think this is very, very neglected, but just as Greece has moved mainstream Western, the anti-Phanerio discourse has revived. Haven't seen this discourse much in either Russia or Bulgaria, or Serbia, or whatever, or Macedonia for that matter, but it is there, surprisingly. So it is not impossible that this may bring a lot of changes, not all of them positive, to Greece. The fallout of this quarrel, which is felt very deeply by certain sections in Russia and, of course, in Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Kyril, for this thematic mapping, but also country to country, very comparative, and a lot of issues there. And hope expectations from you to tell us about the particular case of Serbia.
Yes, thank you very much, Othon. Now, luckily, particularly Maxim referred to a lot of the points, so I won't be as repetitive. I mean, between me and Maxim, there is frequently some correspondence in the type of arguments that are being made. Now, when it comes to Serbia, of course, the very intellectually lazy but popular explanation, which can frequently be found in the media, is that this is an ancient alliance between two brotherly Slavic Orthodox nations. But if we take a look at historically, this relationship has been much more opportunistic for that matter. How close the two countries would tend to be depending on a certain period in history, that always depended on two factors. Number one, the balance of power at a given point in history, and number two, who were the elites in power in the two respective countries. Now, on that point, I think that behind this warm facade of brotherhood, which is projected by leaders in both Serbia and Russia, I think that there is a hidden mistrust between the two. Because the Russians essentially know that the Serbs are only using them to increase their bargaining power with the West. They are only using them to blackmail and leverage the West. While on the other hand, the Serbs are never certain whether the Russians will sell them out in some hypothetical great power bargain with the West. That is a historical theme of the elites. And I tell you, the Serbian foreign policy still operates in a world which was ushered in 2008 with two key systemic realities which came for Serbia and which haven't changed since then. Number one was independence of Kosovo and, of course, the international dispute which began then. And since then, counter-secession and territorial disputes have been alpha and omega of Serbian foreign policy. And number two is the global financial crisis, which essentially left Serbia on the European periphery. Back in 2012, Dimo wrote for European Council of Foreign Relations that policy report, which I remember very vividly, Periphery of the Periphery. That was the title. Now, of course, and this is the point. Russia frequently, yes, it does take pleasure in the fact that it likes to see the fact that the Balkans is not integrated into the Western structures. They like the fact that the West is disoriented in the Balkans. And the most beautiful part about it is that most of the time, the Russians didn't have to do much about it. Most of the time, it was either the EU's inability to effectively mediate or the opportunistic nature of the local elites, which held them out on this particular point. At the same time, the domestic politics in Serbia also plays a very, very important part in this balancing act. Sometimes it is simply to avoid unpopular policies. You don't want to be smashed by the nationalists, so you have to be tough in Kosovo dispute, and for that one you need diplomatic protectors, so enter Russia. At the same time, you have divided society where some are pro-Russian, some are anti-Russian, some are pro-Western, some like to chant to the Russians' name, but they still want to emigrate to the West. So to deal with this divided society, to win the votes of multiple people in this emotionally divided society, you balance. So basically, it's a part of catch-all voters tactic. And number three, it is also the part of the kingmaker's game. Because depending on the circumstances, if you are seen as having a backup of either Western powers, sometimes Russia, that can help you get ahead in front of your competitors in the domestic struggle for turf and in the domestic struggle for power. Now, I would say that even before and after the war, Russia had three sources of influence. its influence is limited, but the sources of influence that Russia does utilize in both Serbia and the wider Balkans are being used quite skillfully and quite effectively. Number one, gas supply. I won't talk much about it, given that it was mentioned several times. Number two, alpha and omega of Serbia-Russia relations, the unresolved Kosovo dispute. And this is also the point where this type of distrust can also be found below the surface. Why? What does Serbia want in the Kosovo dispute? It wants to play a tough bargain so that at one point it can get some form of settlement which can be sold to the domestic audience. Something which can be used as a pay-saving settlement, something that the domestic elites in Serbia can sell to their domestic audience. Something where Serbia is not perceived as being the sole loser of the Kosovo saga. That's what Serbia wants from the Kosovo dispute. What does Russia want? Russia wants to obstruct the West with the Kosovo dispute until someone in the West comes and say, help us out with this, and the Russians will say, we will help out with Kosovo, but that also means you have to help us out. So whether it is the analogies with Crimea, Donbass, or some other frozen conflict. And that is why, for example, Donald Trump's presidency is both a potential opportunity, but as well as the potential threat for the Serbian leadership. If the grand bargain does take place, then Serbs will say whether we can see whether in this bargain we can get something for us. But if the great bargain happens and Serbia doesn't get anything, that's essentially a failure of the past 16 years of Serbian political history and the past 16 years of Serbian foreign policy. And number three source of influence, we mentioned gas, we mentioned the unresolved Kosovo dispute. But number three is the one that I believe particularly became pronounced after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is soft power, Russia's popularity among parts of the local population. And what is the nature of Russian soft power? Russian soft power is simply not reduced to Slavic and Orthodox ties. It is being reduced to 2 years, 1999 and 2008. And essentially, as I pointed out in one publication which I authored with Maxim back in late 2022 about the Russian soft power in Serbia Russia is popular not for what it is, but for what it is not. It is not the West. And I think that this is the key point. The war in Ukraine has, in a sense, exposed the nature of Russian challenge in both the Serbia and the Balkans. Russian challenge in the Balkans is not a military challenge because Russia has no boots on the ground. It is not an economic challenge because when it comes to economic partnerships, the EU is in a league of its own. The Russian challenge is a normative and emotional challenge. Because for many for parts of the local population, Russia is this psychological symbol through which you vent out your grievances and frustrations against the West. Some of these grievances can be real, some of these can be even justified, some of these grievances can be perceived and far-fetched, but Russia is this filter through which you vent them out. Okay, America did this, at least we are seeing the Russians in Ukraine giving the Americans and all the Ukrainian Western backers a bloody nose. I know it is morbid, given that we are talking about human lives after all in Ukraine, but this is how local population manifests this type of emotions, and it affects, of course, the foreign policy behavior of Belgrade vis-a-vis the Russians. And I can also tell you that Russian influence has suffered some degree of setbacks in both Serbia and the Balkans. We cannot import Russian seaborne oil via the Croatian pipeline of Janaf because of EU embargo. In 2022, Sergei Lavrov had to cancel his planned trip to Belgrade. Why? Because European airspace is closed to the Russian airlines. We cannot buy Russian weaponry, including those weapon systems which we have paid for in advance, also because of the European territory blockade. The only Russian weapon system which we have been able to get is the repellent anti-drone system, probably via third-party Turkey, but the big hardware we cannot get. Meanwhile, we also have the fact that that in the past 2 years, despite the fact that the pro-government media and pro-government tabloids don't report about this, it is the US which has become a primary partner of Serbia when it comes to defense policies. The only international military exercise in which Serbia participated, which was essentially exempted from the ban which Serbian government introduced on international military exercises when the Ukraine war broke out, was the 2023 Platinum Wolf exercise with the US. Serbian soldiers were also dispatched to Sinai along their US counterparts to the US-led peace mission in Sinai, and Serbia essentially broke an old practice of never dispatching soldiers in a peacekeeping mission which is non-UN and non-EU. So essentially this is a US-led mission, so that also tells you So that also tells you something. But as Maximo has also pointed out, there is this transactional element. Why? Because Serbia, as well as these couple of other governments in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, they provide Russia with a good optic. An optic that Russia hasn't been fully kicked out of the region and that there are still cooperative governments. And at the same time, we also see the fact that for the Serbian government, the Russians are still useful in trying to discredit some of their local opposition. When we had violent anti-government protests in late 2023 over electoral irregularities in the capital of Belgrade, the Serbian government said that the Russian intelligence services warned us about the West organizing the color revolution against us. So Russia is useful for the domestic PR, but that also means that Serbian government also has to pay back some services against Russians, which in this case can be some potential cooperation between the intelligence services or a pressure by the Serbian authorities against Russian anti-war activists who are stationed in Belgrade. But on this point, I think that what does this tell us about Serbian realities? I would say that on balance, both US and European powers have a majority share package in both Serbia and the Balkans. And I even think that it might be a controlling share package, because the one thing that the Serbian incumbent coalition cannot afford is to have West as the enemy. So that probably makes it a controlling package by default. But they are still not throwing the number of either Beijing or Moscow through the window. Why? Because both Beijing and Moscow are still useful to increase their leverage and bargaining power with the West. And on that point, I will end on.
Thank you very much, Vuk. In the end, also you brought China as well into this anti-Western thought, which Julie also kind of mentioned in her presentation. Now, let's open it up with your question. I mean, there have been so many issues, and I will take a first round of questions. I see one hand here. George, introduce yourself, please, before you ask the question, and then ask the question.
So my name is George. I'm actually working on the Eastern program here at CONSORTIUM. I wanted to thank you to begin with for this wonderful panel. And I want to take a moment to synthesize two topics raised by Dr. Newton and Dr. Drezov. Dr. Newton mentioned very correctly the rise of the populist right or left nowadays, and Dr. Drezov mentioned the role of energy and energy security to begin with. And the thought I had is that we tend to think of populists as the source of effects, right? The independent variable, and this, of course, important. Orban has an important role to play in European geopolitics. But what about understanding why populists emerge? And this is where I'd like to go to the role of energy first, because what essentially we're living in right now is an energy-induced inflationary crisis. Romania had an inflation of 11% last year. This is, of course, not native to Romania. This is the same thing that we're seeing in Britain, in Germany, in France, in Austria, and all to the same effect. Again, the rise of the populist right or left. And Orban also emerged the same way. Because of the financial crisis, the Socialist Party of Hungary collapsed, and Orban came to be. And my question is, I'm not going to go on too much further, even I'd like to mention that the Americans have been telling us for a very long time, and even went as far as saying to us 15 years ago that perhaps energy should be the next step in the process of European integration. That's the importance they ascribe to. But my question is, don't you think that Europe should be approaching Southeast Europe in this context in a different way, and perhaps a more successful way?
Thank you, George. Yes, Dimo.
Thanks for this panel, and thanks for all the references. I feel I learned a lot by listening to you when we discuss this topic for a long time. And I want to pick up on something that several of you have raised, the Trump factor. And I was just wondering, what will be the reaction or the response of the region to Trump? Of course, it will differ from country to country. But is it the case that since Trump introduces uncertainty, those governments and the states will be hedging even more? Or just the opposite, they'll be doubling down on their relationship with the US, i.e. Romanians or Bulgarians selling it at the White House and purchasing even more hardware from the states, even Serbia, Or is it even more US focused in parallel to NATO? Or is it let's keep the Russian option and the Chinese option because we don't want this uncertainty to undermine us? And just a small comment to Kyril, I'm not as alarmist on Transnistria because the behavior of Transnistrian elites, the sheriff network, has been very low key. I mean, they don't want any trouble. They have signaled time and again they want to stay out if possible. And the offensive potential of the troops stationed there is very low. And they're vulnerable to Ukraine as well. So maybe that's wishful thinking, but I think that's how many people think about occupation as part of Moldova.
Thank you. We can take a third one. And since there's no third one, I will ask the third one. And that is going to go to Vuk, because I would like you, if you could, to expand a little bit more on the issue of Russian emigration to Belgrade, how this has kind of affected, you know, the nature of the place with this enhanced Russian presence. Okay, let's start with Julie then.
No, I think your question on why do populists emerge? Why is it such fertile ground? Well, you hear from my accent where I come from. So, you know, Trump is very much in the forefront of my mind. Is why does this happen? It's such a shock. So it's not just in Southeast Europe or in now in you know, France. That government is about to be over. Well, the government itself is being overturned. You have the same problems in Germany. I mean, you know, you brought that up yourself. It's a global, certainly a Western phenomenon. And, you know, I that's such a huge question, particularly for, I think, Americans who are deeply concerned as to the Trump factor. Where do liberal populists, whether it's right or left, as you say, where do they come from? Certainly, you know what, I think for Southeast Europe, I'll just respond to that. One of the things that comes over and over again, and again, you talk about this a lot in a lot of your coverage of this stuff, it's just the economic corruption, the lack of rule of law, the sense of frustration. You mentioned inflation, of course, but obviously all the economic problems are exacerbated by bad governance, and then ethnic grievances, which are then, I think, are exacerbated and accelerated by external involvement. And then, of course, I think the lack of listening to civil society, perhaps a lot of what the EU has tried to do is perhaps too top down in the past, you know, especially, and not enough engagement with these civil societies so that they would have an outlet, a better outlet for their grievances. You know, I don't know the solutions to these things, but you put your finger on it. It's something that we, I think, as all of our societies need to deeply think about, and first and foremost in the United States and also in this country, quite frankly. And a lot of it has to do with economic inequality, all of that, which goes back to corruption. So I obviously don't have an answer, but I love your question because it's something that I think is one of the problems that is probably the most important problem for the West right now and all our countries.
Thank you, Julie. Maxim, would you like to address some of the questions?
Yeah, sure. There was a question on energy. Yeah, how the European Union should deal with the energy issues in the Balkans. I'd say that I wouldn't consider the current situation so catastrophic. At least if we measure it by Russian expectations, the current situation is quite good. Because when the Kremlin came up with its demand for paying for gas, for Russian gas in rubles, when they started problems in the Nord Stream and so on, the expectation in Russia was actually that the Europe will not be able to survive without Russian energy. But what we see, it will have to crawl back to Moscow and plead for the renewal of deliveries of Russian gas, because countries, especially in the Balkans, such countries as Bulgaria, would simply collapse without Russian energy. It turned out very differently. We see that, yes, there was a short-term increase in inflation, which was still below 20% in most of the countries. But beyond that, not much happened. We see that now, even without Russian gas, most countries of the region are doing quite well. And the situation has stabilized. It's already almost 3 years in Russia since Russia stopped deliveries. We see that countries are adapting, that the multi-year efforts of the European Union to diversify delivery routes have bore fruits. Yeah, we see that countries now can access LNG delivered to the ports of Greece and Turkey. We see that there are alternative gas pipelines and interconnectors between them to increase to speed up the exchange of energy between these countries. So I'd say, yes, the situation is not ideal, it's not perfect, but in comparison, what could have happened, yeah, and especially to what Moscow expected to happen, it's far from being bad. Yeah, there was a shock, but it's gradually being overcome. And also, there was a question about Russian immigration to Belgrade. I was such an immigrant. I was one of those immigrants who moved to Belgrade in 22 and lived there for 1 year. It was a great time, and I regret having to leave Belgrade. I'd say that I have quite a few friends who still live in Belgrade, yeah, and I have communicated very much with Russians who moved to Belgrade. I'd say that their impact, despite they are quite numerous, but their impact on the Serbian domestic politics or Serbian external policy even more is quite limited. Most of them perceive Serbia as a temporary stopover. With all these programs which facilitate the receipt of Serbian citizenship, their plans, I'm reproducing the opinions of many Russians I've talked to on this issue, that their plan is to spend in Serbia 3 to 5 years to secure Serbian citizenship, and then they'll see what are the other options. Most of them even don't study Serbian, even though for a Russian speaker, it's very easy to learn Serbian. You need just few months to start speaking on the everyday level. Yeah? But even this looks too much for them. It's quite isolated community. They communicate with each other. They are self-sufficient because it's a community big enough you can offer services only in Russian to the Russian community, and you'll have enough clients. You don't need to venture in the Serbian market, actually. Yeah. So I'm quite skeptical about the impacts this Russian community, despite being quite numerous, might have on the Serbian domestic politics. I think it will be quite limited. And the presence of most of the Russians in Belgrade, unfortunately, is likely to be also limited in terms of time frame.
Thank you, Maxim, and for this personal experience as well. Kyril.
I'll start with the last thing about the Russian community. I just want to mention that there are some interesting similarities to the Russian migrant communities after the revolution, who initially flocked to countries like Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, and then moved on to France and other countries. And again, they would be fairly isolated services in Russian, etc., etc. So there are some interesting parallels on that. And I mentioned the pariah status of Russia as a result of what happened in 2022. Now, on energy, previous speakers are absolutely right that the worst case scenarios and what, say, Russia expected did not happen. But the price that the population is paying is huge, hence the populism. I see this as an extremely dangerous situation, and I do not see any immediate remedy to that. Now, the countries, ostensibly, countries like Bulgaria have quite dramatic growth as countries, but there is also a huge growth in satisfaction because of the prices in the shops. I was in Bulgaria last week, and I can say that the average prices in the shops are like in Britain. Only the wages aren't the same. So, other than peace suddenly being restored, sanctions being lifted on Russia for whatever reason, and energy flowing again to Europe, I actually see no immediate way of actually solving that. We will have more and more surprises like Romania with 30%, not pro-Russian, but just tapping dissatisfaction. So that thing on energy. Concerning Trump, Dim's question, I think that the initial, my impression is the initial effect of Trump would be that there will be more ostensible sort of flocking to the flag, to the US, and kind of countries would behave ostensibly more as more pro-American politicians also, because one of the things that Trump is very proud about is that he can instill fear of his unpredictability, and this thing will create this immediate effect. Now, longer term, I guess that there will be more hedging, but I think that the really interesting thing is not so much how the Balkan countries would hedge as a result of Trump, but how countries like France and Germany would hedge. Finally, on Transnistria, I fully agree that Transnistria by itself is not a problem. The far bigger problem is Moldova. What we've seen with the last elections is the country is divided right down the middle. And even physically, it's like Chisinau and the countries, well, the regions to the south and around Chisinau have voted for Sandu, and Biltsi and kind of the northern part have veered towards Durango. So again, for the sake of comparison, I can say that Moldova seems to be roughly where Ukraine was in the 2004-2010 period, sort of divided right down the middle, kind of pro-West and or anti-Western. So I see Moldova as a potential problem, not by itself again, and not even Transnistria, but imagine that the front moves towards Odessa, and what will be the reactions? For me, this is the biggest long-term worry. It's not an immediate problem, but Odessa is the crucial part of Ukraine because it borders Transnistria, it borders Moldova. It actually is the only outlet left to Ukraine to the sea. So Odessa would be quite a decisive part. But that's kind of more.
Thank you, Kyril.
Yes, of course, both the question about the Russian expats and about Dino's question about Trump. Now, when it comes to Russian expats, I think that we have seen something of a partial, but only partial deja vu, historical deja vu, because one of the reasons why the relationship between newly formed Kingdom of Yugoslavia after World War I and the newly formed Soviet Union were almost non-existent was among other things because Serbian dynasty, which ruled Yugoslavia, Karađorđević and the Romanov dynasty were relatives, and there were a lot of white Russian emigres who came, anti-Bolshevik Russians who emigrated to Serbian parts of Yugoslavia at that time. Now, partially, of course, one can say that there is something there now, given that most of these Russian expats are most of the time are liberals from places like Moscow and St. Petersburg. When it comes to initial, how shall I say, social element, there was, of course, this shock of real estate prices going up in Belgrade. Most of the Serbs were surprised because these Russians didn't meet their warm brotherly expectations. I mean, most of the Serbs probably expected Ivan Dragov from Rocky Part 4, but they got an IT hipster from St. Petersburg. So that was probably a disappointment. So that was probably a disappointment for them. But I think that one of the reasons why I think that Russian experts were attracted to Belgrade was not just the issue of safety, but I think that there was one social attitude that there was this because if they were to come to London or to Netherlands, they would even though they would be accepted, there would still always be this reserve of them having to justify whether they are proponents of the ruling regime or Russia or not. Unlike in Serbia, there is this culture where the Serbs said, we remember the 1990s where we were the pro-Western anti-war Serbs were always looked with skepticism. So this type of social stigma was not there. But when it comes to political ramifications of it all, so far the pressures exercised against the anti-war Russian activists by the government, it initially was the policy of a single man, the pro-Russian ex-intelligence director Volin, who was probably doing it initially as his revenge against the Americans for blacklisting him, so he can say, I cannot retaliate against the Americans, but I can go after the Russian liberals that you value so much. But I think that after the late 2023, it is probably about Belgrade having to return some favors to Moscow as a result of some propaganda wins that Moscow has secured for the incumbent Belgrade government. But whether they will be whether they will be the main focus of Serbo-Russian relations, these Russian expats, that depends on the issue which Maxim has outlined, how deep these Russian expats become integrated into the Serbian society. Because if they become deeply integrated into the Serbian society, they might nudge the public opinion slightly in a way in which Serbia does not become a Russia hawk, but where people start to take a look at the incumbent Russian government with less of a rose-painted glasses. But in that case, we might see a change where Russia might shift from its traditional focus of trying to win over local hearts and minds to trying to suppress the influence of these Russian expats. But as Maxim said, most of the time they are an insulated community, so we are not there at this point in history. Now, when it comes to Dimo's question about Trump effect, I think that the result of US elections would have been a disappointment one way or the other. Those who believe that Kamala Harris would have encouraged the Democratic potential in the Balkans. I like to remind them that Alexander Vučić has been in power in Serbia for 12 years, and 8 out of those 12 years correspond with the Democratic US presidential administrations. So I kept telling them the democratic progression or democratic transgression is homegrown, much more dependent on the local sources and not on Washington, Beijing, or Moscow for that matter. I think that the first Trump presidency exposed a very, very important pattern in which the Balkan nations, whenever they are frustrated with the European Union, they go to the US. The US might not always be enthusiastically interested in the Balkans, but they know if the US pledges something, they have enough muscle to deliver. And I think that this impulse is particularly strong in Serbia, and I think it is also present in North Macedonia. And it is present, I think, in Albania, given that for Tirana, the alliance with Washington is a sacred cow which cannot be questioned, so to speak. And this pattern we will probably see even now, but I think that the sore point in Belgrade's relationship with Washington will not be Kosovo, it will not be Russia, it will be China. And that is the point where both Vučić and Orban will be in a tight spot. Because yes, they may like Trump and Trump may like them, but I expect that when it comes to China, Trump will be a jealous lover who will be saying, if you want my assistance, you have to tone down your partnership with Beijing.
Thank you both. Next round of questions. Yes.
So, Jasna Dragovic Sozo from the MSC.
Please keep the question to the more.
Yeah, so my question continues along the lines of what Dima started asking about Trump. And I would like to ask you to speculate a little bit, because of course, one of the things that has been announced by Trump is that there will be an end to the war in Ukraine quite soon. How this will end and, you know, what sorts of...
24 hours.
Yeah, what sorts of, you know, the kind of settlement that it will produce is obviously going to have some impact also on the Balkans. And I would just like you to think about, well, what might be some of the impact of an end to the Ukraine war, and what kinds of possible scenarios do you see?
Thank you, Jasna. Yes. Yes, yes.
I used to be here. Sorry, I have two questions, one of which is really following on from, I think, the very last point. We've had a lot on the region's attitude to Russia, but also given Russia and Ukraine, I mean, what is the attitude of these countries, A, to Turkey and B, to China? Which, I mean, Turkey had been trying to get influence before. Is that was And similarly, China, there's going to be a definite dichotomy if they're, you know, trying, if Trump is putting pressure on other countries to break with China, what does that happen? My second question is something which hasn't been raised at all, except it sort of underlies certain things. Until Ukraine, the EU was heavily into the European Green Deal. Have we forgotten about climate change now? Was that just a luxury? But since everybody's keen on energy now, and you know, Trump's back and drill baby drill, is it that it's more important that we get gas, we get oil, than will we worry about what's happening to the future climate? Do you have any views on that? Is there any notion anywhere of still maintaining any I mean, advancement in the region on the transition to a green economy? Was that just put to the side now?
Thanks, Charles. Who else want to ask a question? We have seen that. I'm just looking at the back as well in case I. Yes, please.
Suppose that I'm a different graduate in social and cultural anthropology, and now I'm based back in St. Petersburg, and I'm interested to ask maybe the speakers, Dr. Serbia, if the Russian migration to countries like Serbia, where you can still actually have a flight and go back to Russia or from Russia to Serbia, would have a leverage on Russian lives back in Russia, because like when you're based in Russia, you feel the people who move now belong to sort of to the camp of some others who are solving their personal lives, integrating into the West or into the South, the East European world. But we, like, I'm wondering if there would be groups of Russians who could move but could influence the situation. But in Russia, and especially in Serbia, there's still a connection in politics.
Thank you, Julia, for this question. It's about the diaspora remittances back to the country in the social, political, and economic as well. But the social political is more interesting in this case. Is there any other question for this round? Eli Gateva.
Hi, I'm Eli Gateva. I'm based in the Department of Politics and International Relations. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I wanted to ask you perhaps to reflect on a certain extent how the EU has reacted to the developments in the border region as a result of the full-scale invasion and the war in Ukraine. Because many have agreed that basically the Western Balkans have been neglected or forgotten for a very long time, and that since the full-scale invasion, the EU has reconsidered its commitment to the region. In your opinion, do you think that there has been, how would you reevaluate the EU's engagement with the region?
Are you asking specifically enlargement or more broadly?
Broadly, I mean, because obviously Bulgaria and Romania are also important, and they have been, maybe they will become full-scale members of Schengen as of the 1st of January, so a broader commitment is required.
Thank you, Eli. Okay, let's go back to books this time, and then we'll go finish with Julie.
No, I mean, here are the points that I can address. Now, the question about China and Turkey, those ones I can address. Now, China for the past 6 years has replaced Russia as Serbia's primary partner outside the Western world. And I think that this process has only been vindicated with the war in Ukraine. However, I also say that there is always the main, how shall I say, check on Sino-Serbian partnership is US and not Brussels. I mean, we have seen that during this year's President Xi Jinping's visit to Belgrade, that it wasn't particularly impressive. It was an impressive visit, but not with the wow effect as the people expected it to be. And I believe that as Sino-American Cold War begins to take a full swing, there will probably be this impulse in Belgrade where they will say, Cold War, okay, we've been here before, we know how this game is played. And I expect that one way in which the Serbian elites will try to balance this particular relationship is they will say, okay, for us, Beijing is a diplomatic partner and it is an easy source of for investment and infrastructural credit lines, but in areas which are deemed strategic for Washington, whether it is rare earth minerals, critical raw materials, or whether it is 5G infrastructure, or whether it is high-tech defense systems. On these points, we have to scale down our partnership with China. Now, when it comes to Turkey, I think that Turkey will be with us one way or the other in the Balkans, even though I think that its involvement in other regions and its lack of capacity, I say that depends on how much, there is a limit of how much attention and resources Ankara can invest in the Balkans, particularly since it has some other hotspots like Ukraine and Syria, I mean, not that far from its own shores and borders. But going forward, I think that this transactional, less ideological approach the third one has adopted, has bore some fruits in the Balkans because there are local leaders who think similarly like him. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. So, but this also, I think, will create him sooner or later. The biggest challenge going forward, I think, for him will be to balance what Turkey still believes are the two key strategically consequential ethnic groups in the Balkans, which are Serbs and Albanians. How do you balance the two? When you have elephant in the room, which is called the unresolved Kosovo dispute. So that will be the key challenge. When it comes to the issue of whether this Russian expat community can change things. Now, to be frank, one of the big problems is that this happened at the beginning of the war. There was a lot of anger over the fact that Belgrade, Moscow, and Belgrade, St. Petersburg flight were carrying on, and there was even an idea for Air Serbia to introduce additional flights because there was such a high demand for these flights. But because of the anonymous bomb reports constantly being reported to the police, they had to give up on this idea. And as a result of it, these flights is one of the most expensive and most, in such a high demand, it is one of the most expensive ones. You can basically fly from Belgrade to Tokyo probably at a cheaper price compared to Belgrade and Moscow. But I think that this has also been something of a short-sighted because I did believe, and that is something which I mentioned in conversation with some of my Western colleagues back home, where I did say, if you want to have some degree of communications and overtures with the Russian society, this is something which you should potentially entertain. And I'm not saying that anyone is entertaining this idea at this moment in time. And yes, I mean, the Ukraine war, I mean, some of the potential scenarios, ramifications about how the Ukraine war impacts the Balkans. I think that if Russia emerges victorious, I mean, we are still debating about what will be the extent of this Russian victory in Ukraine. I think that this will not change strategically. It will change probably for Romania and Bulgaria, given that there will be a lot of heat on them being now a NATO border states. For them, that will change a lot, but not that much for Serbia or Bosnia or Montenegro because they will still be far away. But it will raise the temperature because all the pro-Russian voices in the Balkans will be fired up. They will say, why are we still pursuing this bankrupt EU path when Russia is so strong that it is able to win in a war despite all the backing that the West has provided to Ukraine? So it will still, the biggest challenge will still be here, so to speak, as a result of Ukraine war. And I also think that this is again that problem, whether there is a great deal as part of Ukraine, whether Kosovo and Kosovo Donbass and Kosovo Crimea analogies do enter into a frame. And that is still, for me, that is the biggest question mark.
Thank you, Kyril.
Yes, I'm continuing what Vuk started, Jasper's question. Now, what has horrified the elites of the Balkans is that the Western policy from 2014 onwards, which was focused on integrating Ukraine into the Western sphere, put it this way, paradoxically and dialectically has actually achieved the opposite. It is bringing Russia closer and closer to the borders of Romania and Bulgaria and into the Black Sea. This, I think we have to ask ourselves a more general question about everything that the West has done from 2014 onwards concerning Ukraine, is it not destroying Ukraine? Is it not emboldening Russia? Is it not bringing Russia closer to the NATO borders? So I think we all need a radical rethink on that, because it seems that this strategy of integrating Ukraine is not working. It is actually achieving the opposite. It's destroying Ukraine, and it is bringing Russia closer and closer to EU and NATO borders. So that's one thing. The other possible scenario, which is being touted a lot these days, is about the frozen front. So the front, I think this is a no less disastrous kind of approach, because it basically postpones the war. It's not so different from what I said so far. It basically, it's basically saying everyone keeps his kind of opinions, whatever. We draw a line, something like Korea, but I strongly suspect it will not be as frozen as Korea for a variety of reasons. There would be a desire for revanche on the Ukrainian side. Neither would Russia sit idly and kind of with that. As for the agreements, guarantees, and all that, I think it's a pipe dream. I think the frozen front thing doesn't work. Which brings me to what I think is possibly a more profitable ways. We have to ask ourselves the question: what made Ukraine tick before 2014? It was certain very delicate balances between Russian and Ukrainian speakers, which have been destroyed by the war. And basically, what in the heat of the war, what the Zelensky administration has done is the opposite of what Zelensky has promised when he won the election. Ukraine has moved into a monolingual, to become a monolingual country, and basically effectively banish Russian from any official use, etc., etc. And the result is that we talk about a lot about how Ukraine has suffered, but the one community that has suffered most are the Russian speakers of eastern and southern Ukraine. They have no home right now. Basically, they say, and I'm actually I've been looking at something that the Ukrainian refugees is saying. They say we're Ukrainian patriots. We don't want to live in the Russian. A particular town that she comes from says was taken over by Russia. This town is destroyed. This is how Putin liberates the Russian speakers. So there is no space for them in Russia, but there is also no space for them in Ukraine, because just as Russia doesn't accept them as Russian-speaking Ukrainians, it wants them to be Russian-speaking Russians. And the same thing is happening on the Ukrainian side, because Ukraine doesn't accept them as Russian-speaking Ukrainians. I can read you two lines on that just very briefly. We are, to put it mildly, not liked at all and are oppressed by both adults and children. They engage in bullying. They refuse to rent an apartment without plan agreement, talking about refugees in central or western Ukraine. When they find out we're from Donbass and hear Russian speech, they either refuse to talk or ignore us or engage in rude arguments. I'm afraid for my children. So I think we need to go back and think what made Ukraine tick before this whole disaster has unfolded.
I think obviously we don't underestimate as well the number of Ukrainians that have left their country to go to Europe, because that's also a massive number of them that have
A huge number.
forced to leave. Okay, Maxim.
Yeah, I'll start with the question how the end of the war in Ukraine will impact the Balkans. I'm afraid I'm not that optimistic, and I don't think that the end of the war in Ukraine is forthcoming. Somehow today we hear a lot that basically the perception that the only element missing to stop the war was the Trump's victory. I don't think so. I think that even if Trump pushes Ukraine into negotiations, this doesn't mean that the Kremlin will be ready to negotiate seriously. Kremlin is ready to negotiate, but it is ready to negotiate Ukraine's capitulation and nothing less. And if we just look, all the signals coming from Kremlin, official and unofficial, are very clear that besides freezing the hostilities along the front line. And besides Ukraine's non-acceptance to NATO, it's also pro-Russian government in Kiev and a big comprehensive new deal on European security, which Kremlin expects to negotiate with Trump to stop this war. And I don't think that it's so easy to negotiate even for Trump and even with his readiness for concessions. I guess the concessions the Kremlin will ask for will overwhelm even Trump's readiness for compromises. So in my expectation, the best we can get is a short pause before the new escalation. And I rather analyze what will be the impact of this new escalation on the Balkans than the impact of the stop of the war. Yeah. And also there was an interesting question about the impact of the interaction between diaspora and Russian society back in Russia. Unfortunately, I have to say that there are less and less interactions between these parts of Russian society. And even if you look at Serbia and at these flights between Russia and Belgrade, most of the Russians who are using these flights, they're just using Belgrade as a transfer point. 90% of passengers are going to flights further after arriving in Belgrade. And even like if in 2022, people were moving back and forth, they were flying to Russia, and Russians from Russia were flying to diaspora, these instances are becoming less and less frequent. It's very difficult to find a Russian who is going to Russia now. Diaspora and mainland Russian society are diverging from each other. I think this is inevitable. Their perceptions are growing very different. People are getting established in their new lives in Europe, be it Serbia or other country. And I don't think that these interactions between the Russians who remain in Russia and Russians who live in diaspora have any potential to change anything inside Russia, at least at the current moment or in the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Maxim. And before we finish with Julie, because then time will be over, I would like to ask you something else, Maxim, to tell me, with Russia following the war, having built relations with other countries anyway, and much more important relations than the countries in the Balkans, a closer relationship with China, India, countries in the global south. Does Russia really need the Balkans anymore? I mean, what is the added value of the Balkans?
I'd say it didn't need Balkans that much even before the war. It's just the war accelerated the tendencies that has been in place for the last decades, I think. Yeah, so Balkans are getting lower and they are getting more attention in terms of PR. Yeah, in PR attention, the war has boosted the role of Balkans in the Russian propaganda. But in terms of real interactions and in terms of their real role in Russian foreign policy making, I think they have long been quite low on the list of priorities, and now they are even lower.
Thank you. And that's another point on disinformation that we haven't touched, because the region is very prominent towards that kind of Russian strategy. And now we will finish with Julie. And if I could also ask you, Julie, from your own experience, after you answer the questions, of course, from the audience, whether you could tell us a little bit from your consortium experience and dealing with Russian intelligentsia abroad. Is there any kind of impact from those academics, Russian academics that you've been working with?
On what?
What is a good question? The impact maybe on Russia, whether they have any kind of impact, what is the approach towards them, or whether they have an impact on, on you as, academic crowd as well.
Exiles,
Yeah.
Right? Exiles.
Yeah, absolutely. Exiles.
I don't know if I want to answer that if I'm Maxim, but anyway, so to the first question about Trump, I'm not going to talk about Maxim mentioned the impact on perhaps the Balkans a little bit, but I want to pick up from where Maxim left off about how there's no incentive for Putin to negotiate, right? And I totally agree with that. We just came back from talking to a lot of Russians and a lot of European officials and say there's absolutely no sign that Putin has any incentive to negotiate. So in that, then there's more, the idea in the West is you ramp it up with more military pressure, more missiles fired into Russia itself. And what's very interesting about this is the assumption is that will force the Russians to finally to either back down or to stop or something. But from the Russian perspective, more and more, if you just from following around from official press to also expert press, that is a mistaken assumption. The opposite is probably true, that it will not lead Putin to go back to the negotiating table or at least to make more concessions, but that so escalate to de-escalate is a mistake. That it will, the likelihood, this is what the Oreshkin missile was shot for, and this is why the timing of the change in Russia's nuclear doctrine was announced, was to a real warning, say, this is wrong. There are red lines for us. And if you continue to escalate in this way, and if Trump then thinks that he can escalate in this way, because there's a real possibility of this, then you really are playing with fire, and we're not joking. And whether that's lawful, whatever, but it is interesting that the language is changing and that the level of seriousness is just quite high. I mean, I think the CIA came up with some intelligence to say that there's been no shift in any kind of Russian stance on any of this militarily. But there are a lot of people from liberals to military people in Russia that say, watch out, this could even lead to just mistaken sets of assumptions. So many people are saying this is the most dangerous. So quite the opposite from ending the war. This is one of the most dangerous phases in the war. Now until Trump gets in, but even after Trump gets in, if he decides to escalate, to de-escalate. The other thing that I was going to say was, so yeah, I guess, I mean, there's a more positive scenario where and it probably also is not Trump just withdrawing completely. I think there are a lot of people who think that he probably won't just abandon Ukraine, and let's just assume that for a second, but that it would be just pure containment, for the real focus on containment and deterrence of Russia if he pursues a more Atlanticist policy, which is not out of the question for him. And then the appeal then would be the appeal to Trump in order to get him to do that would be to say, you lead a US-Russian set of negotiations, and we'll talk to the Ukrainians and talk to the Europeans on the side. But this is kind of thing that a lot of people like Thomas Graham are proposing, that kind of idea, that make it very much and the Indians are actually saying this, make it very much US-Russian to appeal to Trump, to his egocentric, narcissistic side. And try not to talk over the heads of Ukrainians, which will be almost impossible for him, but to try to come up with a deal within that very US context that would incentivize the Russians, that appeal to status, and possibly throwing in there some trade-off for sanctions and that kind of thing. On the question of, I loved your question about Europe and how has this war changed Europe, right? And that was your question, right? And I think the clearest, it's in two ways. One, it's become more of a geopolitical actor. I mean, it's no longer just a liberal democratic project, a geo-economic actor. It is very much now sees itself as a geopolitical actor. It did not with the Eastern Partnership of 2009. It fell into sort of more geopolitical role by accident, but it wasn't something that Brussels set out to do. Now Brussels is setting out to make it into a geopolitical actor if it can. The challenges to become that are enormous for Europe. In fact, in the words of Stephen Walt, Europe is screwed on this, largely because it's technologically so far behind the United States and very dependent upon the United States technologically. So the idea of it becoming strategically autonomous is much more of a pipe dream than it is a reality. And so then you have people like the Germans who are saying, well, then given our difficulty to become a geopolitical autonomous actor, then we'll just have these coalitions of the willing and also variable speeds of integration. for bringing in not only the West Balkans, but also into Europe, but also various speeds of integration into NATO, and and whether or not that is possible, given even that is possible, given the levels of economic slow growth and difficulty and inflation, and then the rise of populism, all that in Europe, whether it's capable of creating a proper defense to become the geopolitical actor that it needs to be, to have a containment, deter Russia from the Baltic Sea all the way down to the Black Sea. I mean, that's quite another question. But the goal, but it does see itself as more of a geopolitical actor, and whether it can be consummated and realized is another question. The other possibility is worse. There's some people who are concerned that if Trump does withdraw from the United States from Europe and cuts Europe loose, and this project that is now a geopolitical project, that it could bring out old rivalries and grievances between European countries back to the future, sort of this idea of Europe really falling apart and old nationalist rivalries coming back. I can't imagine that happening. Maybe it's very much wishful thinking. I absolutely can't imagine, but that is a worst case scenario for how geopolitical Europe could devolve back into its old nationalist animosities. And let's hope that is unthinkable. The consortium, and what kind of impact that has made on Russian exiles. So I was at a very interesting conference in Vilnius, Lithuania, with Russian exiles. Maxim, you were not there, I don't think, at that. It was called Scholars Beyond Borders. And there were a lot of them, and they complained about this very fact, that they have not been able to consolidate as exiles in order to have the kind of impact that they need, that there's so many rivalries between them. It's an old Russian problem of how do you bring all these exiles together to have any kind of an impact. And then you see the Navalny versus, the Khodorkovsky rivalry and all those kinds of things and all the splits. It's quite tragic, really. So I think the impact amongst exiles has been not nearly, Alex Probst and I talk about this quite regularly, how it's the impact of exiles is, the potential is it's extraordinarily important that it be able to have an impact and be able to help Westerners be a bridge, but find a bridge back to Russia. But so far, there's not much evidence of that, and I say that based on what the lament of these Russian exiles at this conference. The impact it has had on us in the University Consortium, it's tragic. We are not allowed, because of the sanctions and the laws of all of our countries, to bring Russians from Russia. We can only bring Russians like Maxim who have left Russia, and partly it's not even the laws, but partly it's because we don't want to hurt the Russians who come out of Russia. We don't want to cause security problems for them. We are an undesirable, the Carnegie Corporation is an undesirable organization, and so therefore when they go back home, if they come out, they go back home and they put their own families or their own jobs at risk, this kind of thing. So there's almost an inherent sort of self-censoring to even invite them, to reach out to them. So there is this wall, and it's very upsetting and worrying because we don't have the proper information from Russia unless we can get access to what Russians are thinking and read more. Obviously, talking to Maxim and people like him is critical, but it's not sufficient.
Thank you very much, Julie, for this final note. And please join me in thanking our excellent panel today. Maxim from Thank you all for coming, and wishing you happy holidays. Enjoy. The students not so much, we need to work as well. But see you next term. Thank you.